Blog Talk Radio.
Discussion with my national security team about the situation in Egypt, and I wanted to provide an update about our response to the events of the last several days. Let me begin by stepping back for a moment. The relationship between the United States and Egypt goes back decades. It's rooted in our respect of Egypt as a nation, an ancient center of civilization, and a cornerstone for peace in the Middle East. It's also rooted in our ties to the Egyptian people, forged through a long-standing partnership. Just over 2 years ago, America was inspired by the Egyptian people's desire for change, as millions of Egyptians took to the streets to defend their dignity and demand a government that was responsive to their aspirations for political freedom and economic opportunity. And we said at the time that change would not come quickly or easily, but we did align ourselves with a set of principles: nonviolence, a respect for universal rights, and a process for political and economic reform. In doing so, we were guided by values, but also by interests, because we believe nations are more stable and more successful when they're guided by those principles as well. And that's why we're so concerned by recent events. We appreciate the complexity of the situation. While Mohamed Morsi was elected president in a democratic election, his government was not inclusive and did not respect the views of all Egyptians. We know that many Egyptians, millions of Egyptians, perhaps even a majority of Egyptians, were calling for a change in course. And while we do not believe that force is the way to resolve political differences, after the military's intervention several weeks ago, there remained a chance for reconciliation and an opportunity to pursue a democratic path. Instead, we've seen a more dangerous path taken through arbitrary arrests, a broad crackdown on Mr. Morsi's associations and supporters, and now, tragically, violence that's taken the lives of hundreds of people and wounded thousands more. The United States strongly condemns the steps that have been taken by Egypt's interim government and security forces. We deplore violence against civilians. We support universal rights essential to human dignity, including the right to peaceful protest. We oppose the pursuit of martial law, which denies those rights to citizens under the principle that security trumps individual freedom, or that might makes right. And today, the United States extends its condolences to the families of those who were killed and those who were wounded. Given the depths of our partnership with Egypt, our national security interests in this pivotal part of the world, and our belief that engagement can support a transition back to a democratically elected civilian government, we've sustained our commitment to Egypt and its people. But while we want to sustain our relationship with Egypt, our traditional cooperation cannot continue as usual when civilians are being killed in the streets and rights are being rolled back. As a result, this morning we notified the Egyptian government that we are canceling our biannual joint military exercise, which was scheduled for next month. Going forward, I've asked my national security team to assess the implications of the actions taken by the interim government and further steps that we may take as necessary with respect to the U.S.-Egyptian relationship. Let me say that the Egyptian people deserve better than what we've seen over the last several days. And to the Egyptian people, let me say the cycle of violence and escalation needs to stop. We call on the Egyptian authorities to respect the universal rights of the people. We call on those who are protesting to do so peacefully and condemn the attacks that we've seen by protesters, including on churches. We believe that the state of emergency should be lifted, that a process of national reconciliation should begin, that all parties need to have a voice in Egypt's future, that the rights of women and religious minorities should be respected, and that commitments must be kept to pursue transparent reforms of the Constitution and democratic elections of a parliament and a president. And pursuing that path will help Egypt meet the democratic aspirations of its people while attracting the investment, tourism, and international support that can help it deliver opportunities to its citizens. Violence, on the other hand, will only feed the cycle of polarization that isolates Egyptians from one another and from the world, and that continues to hamper the opportunity for Egypt to get back on the path of economic growth. Now, let me make one final point. America cannot determine the future of Egypt. That's a task for the Egyptian people. We don't take sides with any particular party or political figure. I know it's tempting inside of Egypt to blame the United States or the West or some other outside actor for what's gone wrong. We've been blamed by supporters of Morsi. We've been blamed by the other side as if we are supporters of Morsi. That kind of approach will do nothing to help Egyptians achieve the future that they deserve. We want Egypt to succeed. We want a peaceful, democratic, prosperous Egypt. That's our interest. But to achieve that, the Egyptians are going to have to do the work. We recognize that change takes time, and that a process like this is never guaranteed. There are examples in recent history of countries that are transitioned out of a military government towards a democratic government, and it did not always go in a straight line, and the process was not always smooth. There are going to be false starts. There will be difficult days. America's democratic journey took us through some mighty struggles to perfect our union. From Asia to the Americas, we know that democratic transitions are measured not in months or even years, but sometimes in generations. So in the spirit of mutual interest and mutual respect, I want to be clear that America wants to be a partner in the Egyptian people's pursuit of a better future, and we are guided by our national interest in this long-standing relationship. But our partnership must also advance the principles that we believe in, and that so many Egyptians have sacrificed for these last several years, no matter what party or faction they belong to. So America will work with all those in Egypt and around the world who support a future of stability that rests on a foundation of justice and peace and dignity. Thank you very much.
Will you cut off aid or just military exercises, and what does this do to Israel policy?
This is VR on the World. Bostonred here with our program, The News in 10. It's extra news in probably 20 minutes, so depending on where we are. We'll comment on a few stories, and then the main story is President Obama's announcement from Washington, D.C. The group Hezbollah has sustained a terrorist attack in Beirut, Lebanon. At least 20-plus people have been killed, over 200 injured in a civilian block. Hezbollah, like many other groups, are community-based, thus their various appendages, headquarters, etc., are in areas where their supporters live. This attack was probably carried out by the same gangs that are in Syria, which these gangs have support of various governments, the Emirates, the U.S., France, etc., that has been arming them with various types of explosives and training them. So again, we have carnage in areas, and for what reason it is, as President Obama pointed out today, a policy interest of the U.S. The problem is in Egypt, he pointed out the elected president, Mohamed Morsi, but his government, quote-unquote, was not inclusive. Well, if you use that type of scenario, many governments throughout the Western world would have been overthrown because they're either inclusive or, as in a polarized country like the U.S., there are 40% or more of the people that do not like the present administration, the Obama administration. They have not liked it. And before President Obama, those people voted against Albert Gore of Tennessee when the election was stolen by G.W. Bush in 8 years of Bush. So people do not necessarily like elected governments, but they live with it. Now, history will show what the real reasons were for deposing Mohammed Morsi. No doubt his independence from quote-unquote the West. And you will hear in the last, you heard President Obama as we came in the last part, debate Congress on Egyptian aid in the past. Various Congress types were speaking. One was Menendez out of New Jersey, talking about the reason for the aid to Egypt is the partnership with the Zionist state Israel. So they see those as complementary of each other. The $1.5 billion military aid, roughly about the same in so-called foreign aid, is second only to the Israeli state. Now, given that partnership and given that official endorsement, and this is over long periods of time. This did not just happen under President Obama. It was under G.W. Bush. It was under Bill Clinton and under the first President Bush going back to Ronald Reagan. So in other words, you have many, many years, many decades of this type of foreign policy. But the problem is with today's social media and the immediacy of things, as the commentator for Al Jazeera said, the administration seems to be behind the curve. It's not that the administration is behind the curve. As President Obama would tell you, he's out on the golf course. He is punting along, or putting along, as one would say, when you actually need a Tiger Woods line drive. This is what the problem is. The UN today evidently has decided to call a session. They said they were not. Where were they? They are not in touch with current world events. Because what's happened to them basically is this. There was a time that, say, several hundred people could be killed. The news would travel very slowly, as it did in Vietnam. You had to take the film from the cameras in the field, take it back to Saigon, and then send it on to another place, another bureau in Asia, or perhaps on to London to get processed. That is not the case. Or a wire person would have sent their dispatch by telegraph. Now you have the mobile phone, the smartphone. You can send your dispatch or your pictures immediately to YouTube, to Facebook, etc., and we immediately get the pictures live. And the reports from various people live. We have the Al Jazeera that comes on the cable or on the net, and various other competing sources, including the people themselves. They were using these little, what you call pilotless, aeroplanes, or drones, whatever you want to call them, with little cameras on them, and as we'd say in the U.S., the dope was out immediately. So thus you have the UN, the Obama administration, and various other Western governments sitting there trying to figure out what nefarious scheme that will work. What the line has been lately, well, Morsi was elected, but he wasn't a Democrat, so we overthrew him. And the violence was there, yes, we deployed, but the other side was burning churches. These are Coptic institutions. We don't know at this mic what the evidence of that was, and that will have to come out later. But what we do know is the security chief, General Al-Masri himself is behind this, and he should stand for human rights violations. They're always, the West that is to put these various people in various countries, Assad, etc., Colonel Gaddafi, his various regimes, before the Hague. Well, if there's a case for putting somebody before the Hague, that's El-Sisi and his cohorts there in Egypt. because this is the most deadly violence in the history of the Egyptian state, at least in the modern history. Going back to the 67 war, there are more people killed in this episode than ever before in the history of Egypt. Now that would tell you something right there. You have thousands of people killed, thousands of people injured, and the demonstrators are going back to the street. As you'll hear in the report, they are still marching. So the big question is, for those of us that model events like this, how many people have to be killed for these people to get on the other side of the curve? We've already had thousands killed, but if 100,000 were killed, what would the UN and President Obama do? Because then it would be a genocide. And this is what is coming, because you have a civil war, and this is just not happening in Cairo or in Nazareth City or in Alexandria. It's happening all over Egypt, and Egypt's a very large country. So many of the people that were killed were in the outlying provinces. I think there are 19 or 20 of those. And they are now occupied by generals that had served President Mohammed Mubarak, in the past, and perhaps beyond him, elderly people. I assume the choice of the elderly people is if they get tried for war crimes, they perhaps would die before the trial. But this is where the situation is, and it's making the world leaders look literally like a clown car, because they are running here and they're giving excuses, but these excuses do not hold the water, because if you are going to put them to a standard, and they do have a standard, they talked about when Colonel Gaddafi killed his own people. Well, even the estimate of the Western powers and of the rats, Colonel Gaddafi did not kill as many people on the scale of these people. And there's really no clear convincing evidence that Colonel Gaddafi killed very many people at all. His regime defended himself, yes, but many of the attacks and things that supposedly happened, the same thing happened in Syria, the so-called chemical attacks, were caused by the counter-revolutionaries, the rebels, and their CIA and various other people. Now, all of this eventually will come out, and it will come out much, much faster today than happened in, say, previous conflicts in Korea, in Vietnam. A lot of the massacres, we remember the My Lai massacre there, it finally came out after it happened, but not instantaneously. Now somebody would have been there with a mobile phone, and they would have been able to upload to YouTube the dead bodies, and we would have known about it immediately. Then all we have to do is investigate the cause. So in other words, it's happening. The foreign policy and the response to military policy, we've seen that in Afghanistan, in Iran, is not in sync with today's technology. The technology is moving forward. So like Moore's law and processes, double, etc. But the problem is that this content, people like myself are pushing out here, Al Jazeera, various other people are pushing out untold thousands that are on the Facebook or on the YouTube and various other social outlets. These things are going worldwide with all of this information. So you have a State Department spokesman, which you'll hear from, speaking there, but he's just one person. It's the same thing as the president. He got off the golf course and got into his uniform and came out and gave an 8-minute speech. But he's given an 8-minute speech, and it'll be parts of it will be seen around the world. But while he's giving his one little 8-minute speech, there are tens of thousands of videos coming out of Egypt of commentary from all kinds of people from all walks of life. And then this comes to a very interesting question. What is the standard here for quote-unquote legitimacy? Do they take the word of the UN, which has been compromised much more than it used to be when it invaded the Congo? Do they take the word of various Western governments, the EU? Those people are behind the curve too. What about the American administration? Where are they? They admit it's an atrocity, but not that bad of an atrocity. Well, It's 500 and something so-called official. It's in the thousands from other people, and they're verifying this, and they're able to verify it. And thousands wounded. So what happens if these numbers start going into the tens of thousands? What do they do at this point in time? Obviously, the people in the street do not have attack helicopters. They do not have rubber bullets. They do not have armored vehicles. Those are all with the Susi gang, General Susi and his people. That is clear. So they're supporting an outlaw. So how can they denounce President Assad for the crimes they claim he's committing and support these people? You can't. This is one of the big problems these people are having. You can't have double standards because people see through your double standards and just dismiss you. We used to have an associate, O.T. Leo. He established something as a free strike thing, and this goes to the Western administration, the Obama administration. You come out once and say it, we'll go along with you. We'll believe you. Say it twice, yes. But the third time, you're dismissed. It doesn't matter who you are. And now this is where the real danger comes in here, when people no longer believe the people. This is sort of like with Mr. Snowden and his affair. Now that they certified the NSA was spying, the CIA, Clapper, who was supposed to put together a panel, that's an insult to any type of transparency. Although he now claims he's not going to be on the panel, it doesn't matter if he's putting it together. He lied before Congress. He should be in the dock, and they should charge him with contempt, and he should be in a D.C. jail. But these kinds of inconsistencies are now much more focused. They are much broader, where people become much, much more cynical of what the government says and what the government does. But the problem is not in the U.S., we won't go into these other operations, on just the administration. It's in the Congress. You heard Menendez speak there, and you heard Feinstein, and we had Senator, what's the old man's name, Inhofe, from the red state of Oklahoma talking there. But he's 80 years old, and anyway, he's been around forever. Since, as we used to say when I was in the military, Christ was a corporal. But nonetheless, that these people have been out here pushing whatever they are pushing for many years. But it doesn't work anymore. They're going to have to go to a new playbook. President Obama is going to give him some new drivers and put his punter away and get on with the program, because the train has left the station. He has to either catch up with it or stay in Martha Vineyard. This is Bostonred. For Bostonred on the World, this is our international affairs program. We're continually tweaking it, and we'll probably change the time because we understand that this will air about 4:30 Eastern time, and we're in the night. What we would like to do is air this program for most of the rest of the world in the day, but we're not too bad in terms of our Greenwich Mean Time, so we're okay. We're in the night across Europe and not quite so in the Mideast, but again, we are archived. Good day.
Our producer, Maisa Khalaf, joins us live on the line from Beirut. And Maisa, I'm just looking at the pictures here. Cars still ablaze, according to these pictures. Rescue workers on the scene, army on the scene, but a lot of chaos and distress in that area. What have you been seeing and hearing?
Yes, exactly. This is what we're seeing. The smoke is still billowing in and around South Beirut. This is a stronghold for Hezbollah. Their cars are still on fire. Buildings, there's residents trapped in several residential buildings. As I want to point out, this is a very civilian-populated area. The area that the car bomb, as we're being told by the Interior Ministry, their office, that this was a car bomb, around 60 to 80 kilograms of explosives. This has created massive aftershocks of explosions in the area. We're seeing bodies being taken to several hospitals around the area. Some wounds we're being told that the number of wounded is rising to roughly 120. This is from the Red Cross. 17 are dead as of now. There's a sense of chaos in the area. Hezbollah security themselves are on the streets and have been, as we're being reported by people in the area, that they have started arresting Syrians, anybody that was near the area. They have shut down the area along with the army. So it's very hard for the journalists and everybody to get to the area of the explosion.
Maisa, we're hearing reports that an Islamist group has claimed responsibility for this blast and says that actually this was its second attack against Hezbollah and it's promising more attacks. Do we know anything about this group?
This is an unknown group. This is the first time that we hear from them. They are called Aisha al-Mu'mineen. We watched the video. They claim responsibility, and they say more to come. This comes after less than 2 months ago, another explosion in early July also went off in a parking lot in Dahia in South Beirut. This time, this was not as big as what we're witnessing now. Children have been targeted, as we see scenes in the hospitals. Children and civilians are mostly the scenes of the attack, who have been attacked. This is a very unknown group, but it is something to take in consideration. Ever since Hezbollah has taken the stance to fight alongside Bashar al-Assad inside Syria, there have been threats from Al-Qaeda-linked groups and Free Syrian Army claiming that they will bring the war to Hezbollah's area, and this is what we've seen today.
Now, I understand Red Cross are on the scene. They're saying that several people are still trapped in the buildings. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, there are 6 buildings that we were told by the Red Cross that were set ablaze, and they are trying to get bodies of residents alive and dead out of the area. It's been very difficult to put out the fire with all the electricity. I mean, as I said, this is a very dense, populated area, so getting into the area, into the explosion site, which set several other cars on fire, has been very difficult for the for the fire trucks to get down there, along with the army. But right now we have it secured. The army is around, along with Hezbollah, and ambulances are coming in and out from the Red Cross.
Maisa, thanks very much indeed for that. Maisa Khalaf. That
movement has called on its supporters to have been protesting in Cairo's Nasser city despite the state of emergency. Earlier, Egyptian state television reported that Morsi supporters stormed a government building in Giza. The Egyptian Interior Ministry has now said that security forces will use live ammunition against people attacking state institutions. Hundreds of people were killed at 2 sit-in camps when they were cleared by police and security forces on Wednesday. The clean-up has begun at the former protest sites in Nasser City and in Giza on the outskirts of Cairo. And funerals have been taking place for the police officers who were killed in that operation. Egypt's health ministry says 569 people, most of them civilians, died. The Muslim Brotherhood says the figure is actually at 2,600, around 5 times higher than the interim government's numbers. Well, the Yemeni Nobel Peace Prize winner Tawakkol Karman has called the Egyptian army's overthrow of President Mohamed Morsi the end for Arab democratic movements.
What we see now is an actual massacre that affects people's freedoms and rights, a real massacre of democratic norms. The Egyptian army did not only target deposed President Mohamed Morsi, they targeted the emerging democracy in Egypt, the January Revolution, the Arab Spring, and the dream of the region's peoples for democracy, freedom, and justice.
Well, the UN Security Council is to hold an emergency meeting on Thursday to discuss the crisis in Egypt. Meanwhile, the US has cancelled joint military exercises with the country's military. President Barack Obama also called for the state of emergency to be lifted. But as Patty Culhane reports from Washington, the billion-dollar aid package for Egypt has not been touched.
These are the images leading American newscasts. A full day after the crackdown in Egypt began, President Barack Obama interrupted his holiday to address the violence.
While we want to sustain our relationship,
The American president, this Egyptian U.S. military exercise, scheduled to start next month, has been canceled. But U.S. military aid has not been stopped. The U.S. gives the Egyptian military $1.3 billion every year, money that undoubtedly helped pay for the symbols of force now on the streets of Cairo. In past debates, members of Congress have been clear on why they want to continue funding the Egyptian military.
If you have any feelings at all for our good friends, our best friends in the Middle East, that's Israel, then you can't consider this amendment.
Making such a significant change to U.S. foreign policy, with all the potential implications for U.S. national security and for our ally Israel, should not be done in haste.
In a kind of nod to the Egyptian military, Mr. Obama did say he understood why they stepped in to depose President Mohamed Morsi.
While Mohamed Morsi was elected president in a democratic election, his government was not inclusive and did not respect the views of all Egyptians. We know that many Egyptians, millions of Egyptians, perhaps even a majority of Egyptians, were calling for a change in course. And while we do not believe that force is the way to resolve political differences, after the military's intervention several weeks ago, there remained a chance for reconciliation and an opportunity to pursue a democratic path.
The U.S. president says that is more difficult now, but still possible, insisting the U.S. is not taking sides, but admitting that is not how it's being seen by anyone here, and that is unlikely to change after his announcement. Patty Culhane, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, Patrick Ventrell joins us live now from Washington, D.C. He's a spokesman for the U.S. State Department. Thanks very much for being with us. Now, we've had just in the past couple of hours the State Department coming out to say that it is reviewing all forms of aid to Egypt. What does that mean?
Hi, Lauren. Thanks for having me on the program. Indeed, as the President said today, we are canceling these joint military exercises, and he has instructed the whole national security team to review further implications for the U.S.-Egyptian relationship. We want a peaceful, prosperous, democratic Egypt, and we're going to continue to watch the events on the ground very closely.
Does it mean that that the U.S. will cut the $1.3 billion in aid that it gives to the military every year?
Well, I don't have any further decisions to announce today. We certainly condemn and deplore this violence. We're certainly watching very closely. You know that we have a long-standing relationship with Egypt, but our long-term goal, and we've been very clear, has been a peaceful, prosperous, fully democratic Egypt, one that has a sustainable democracy.
Which it's not.
And the dreams and the aspirations of the 2011 revolution, as the Secretary of State Kerry said yesterday, have not been fulfilled. And we're not there yet. And so we continue to support the path toward a fully democratic and a fully peaceful Egypt. And yesterday's violence clearly was a serious blow in that path. And so we need to continue to analyze and continue to look at events on the ground, but we'll make our views very clear that we want to get Egypt on track toward the prosperity and the peaceful future that it deserves.
But it is a serious blow. Has it not already gone too far? We've got more than 500 people dead. We've got a military coming out saying that very openly that it is willing to shoot its own people. Is not now the time for the U.S. to act?
Well, indeed, this is a pivotal moment. Certainly, Egyptians have suffered this violence, and while we deplore it, we also want to look at what we can do, given the narrow path forward, to get to the possible democratic future that Egyptians deserve.
But you keep saying we're looking forward to the democratic future. At the moment, this is not a democratic situation in Egypt. We've got the military killing its own people. Again, why is the U.S. not doing more to act? Why is it acting so slowly on this issue?
I would just say that clearly the violence yesterday moves us further away from that goal. And that's why we're reviewing everything so carefully, and why the President has instructed the National Security Team to look at the full breadth of the relationship in the context of this setback.
Is it not the case that the U.S. has been behind the curve the whole time on this story? I mean, we still haven't seen the White House come out and call the events in Egypt a coup, a military coup. The military taking over and deposing the president is a coup, and yet we're not hearing that from the U.S. We're now not hearing any strong message being sent to Egypt, and it's getting away literally with murder.
Look, we support fundamental principles in Egypt. We support nonviolence. We support the protection of universal rights. And we want to help our Egyptian partners get on the correct path. Certainly, this poisonous polarization, this deplorable violence, takes Egypt further away from that path. But we will continue to use all of the breadth of our national security team will continue to use all options to get Egypt back on that path. And we'll continue to look at this. But
when you have the Defense Secretary, Chuck Hagel, calling the Defense Minister in Egypt, al-Sisi, what's the conversation that happens there? I mean, what is Sisi? How is Sisi justifying the events in Egypt?
Well, look, I'm not in a position here from the State Department to read out the Secretary of Defense's calls, but suffice it to say that all of our communication with the Egyptians is similar to what we're saying in public, which is that we condemn and deplore this violence, There were clearly other options. We presented some of those options. Our Deputy Secretary of State was in Egypt a good portion of last week with our EU colleagues presenting some of these options, and we think that while the path is increasingly narrow, there is still a path forward toward democracy despite this despicable and deplorable violence.
Okay, Patrick Ventral, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much. Appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Still ahead here on Al Jazeera.